Welcome to episode 2 of my cup of tea length videos. The idea being that you can tuck into them anytime you've got just a few minutes and a bit of peace and quiet to share some of the things that I'm really interested in. And today this is part 2 of talking about some of the women mountaineers that I introduced to you in part 1. If you haven't seen that, you might like to have a look at that. Today is a continuation of that and thinking about some of the other stories that emerged out of my research into these women between around 1850 and 1914. Some of the things that I wanted to talk about today were things like comfort and how these women actually achieved what they did in clothes that we don't really recognise as being suitable for that kind of activity. I thought I'd start with waterproofing. It's one of those things that we see as a very modern invention, the idea that clothing can be made to perform under certain conditions. Now, 1860s waterproofing was not as we would know it now necessarily, but there were some really interesting strategies in place, and a lot of the information that I found was actually in periodicals like the Queen Ladies newspaper. This shows a picture of a mantle, and it's a waterproof mantle that accompanied an answer to a query about how to waterproof a mantle. And the editor suggests this: to waterproof a canvas smock or any garment of calico or linen, first take 1/4 pound of yellow soap, put it into a little warm water, and with a small broom stir it until it becomes like thin paste. This must be well mixed with a quart of boiled linseed oil. Secondly, having thoroughly wetted the garment, and while it is wet, lay a good coat of the mixture over the outside of it and hang it up in the sun to dry. When it's thoroughly dry, and not before, lay on a second coat of the mixture, and in like manner a third, and the garment will be supple and turn any quantity of rain. These kind of homemade recipes feature a lot in different periodicals at the time, and I think it's really fascinating to see how people were making their own fairly domestic homemade adaptations of garments that they already owned. So it wasn't a commercial endeavour at this point, although there were companies that were starting to explore, companies like Aquascutum and Burberry, who were starting to explore different kinds of performance fibres. The same goes for something like comfort. Now, comfort is, I think, one of the things that maybe dogs the 19th century perceptions of women's wear. I have Hilary Davidson to thank, the brilliant Hilary Davidson, who is a fellow dress history scholar. She talks about the structure of clothes. Now, I'm not a dressmaker, and so this is fascinating. I've looked at lots of garments and I understand construction, but as a maker, she really has talked about this. And that is often when you think about movement in what looks like this kind of very tight tweed garment, which was the sort of thing that women were wearing for hiking and some aspects of outdoor activity in the mid-19th century. It looks to be very restrictive, and yet when you understand sleeve construction of this date, it starts to make a bit more sense. And that's that sleeve heads, where the sleeve attached to the shoulder, were made in a completely different way in the 19th century, and they included what can only be described as a gusset underneath the I'm saying this not as a maker, but I do understand the idea. So it's a gusset that means that there is a great deal more movement in the sleeve than we actually have in our garments today. They're just not made that way anymore. So things that on the face of it appear to be restrictive are in fact not. So that's one of the important points. The other important point about comfort is that we are used to stretch fabrics. We are used to garments that have been made using different technologies, and so our experience of comfort is not their experience of comfort, and I think it's tricky to apply what we think is comfortable onto a 19th century experience. So I thought that some of the women I came across in my research were the highlight of all of it, really, because the tales that they had to tell were so remarkable. And they rarely talked about dress, which I think is important, because I think it meant that it was just normal. They didn't need to tell the reader that the skirt worked really well and they were climbing successfully in it. It just was a non-issue. But sometimes the descriptions that they gave of what they were doing alongside the pictures of what they were wearing whilst they were doing it are very illuminating. Now, this is Fanny Bullock Workman, who was an American mountaineer. She actually held the height record in the Himalayas for a certain length of time, not just for women, but for everyone. She had climbed to the highest point in the at that point in the Himalayas. So she held that height record, and she was well known for her exploits. This is a picture of her in the Himalayas, in the foothills, wearing the garments that she chose. Fairly sturdy tweed skirt or wool skirt. She's got her ropes and all of her equipment there. It's a great picture of a woman who knows what she's about. But when you compare that to the account, looking at that picture and then thinking about the account of what she did, this is something that she wrote on one of her trips to the Himalayas in the early 20th century. And she talks about coming across a crevasse. She said that after scanning its 50 or more feet of length with the lantern, the only way over the crevasse appeared to be a jump near its narrower end. How I hated that leap in the dark across the 4 or 5 feet of invisible space. So it had to be done. So taking the plunge, I landed on the ice slant where the guide stood. Now, I would suggest that if you were in any way in any doubt about the performance of the clothes that you're wearing, you wouldn't be leaping across a 5-foot crevasse. So I think that in itself is very instructive. Another wonderful character is Gertrude Bell. Gertrude Bell is famous for many things. She actually, there's some brilliant biographies about Gertrude Bell. She became instrumental in lots of various diplomatic missions to the Middle East, and was great friends with Lawrence of Arabia, and she has a wonderful life story. But in her 30s, she became a climber and a mountaineer, and always wore a long black skirt to do so. This is her, and this is an account that she wrote about one of her, it was an attempt on the northeast arête of the Finsteraarhorn in 1902. And they were trying to climb, her and her guides were trying to climb a rock face, a wall of blank rock, she described it. So they start to build a kind of human ladder where one of the guides is standing on the shoulders of the other of his brothers. When this failed, this is what Gertrude wrote herself. Ulrich tried it on Heinrich's shoulder and could not reach any hold. I then clambered up onto Heinrich. Ulrich stood on me and fingered up the rock as high as he could. It wasn't high enough. I lifted myself still a little higher, always with Ulrich on me, mind, and he began to raise himself by his hands. As his foot left my shoulder, I put up a hand, straightened out my arm, and made a ledge for him. He called out, "I don't feel at all safe. If you move, we're all killed." I said, "All right, I can stand here for a week." It's one of my favourite stories, that. She later talks when they had achieved that particular part of their mad exploits. She wrote later on about being caught in poor weather and dark. She then described about how her clothes worked in this particular situation. She said when they were in a cave, in a small cave, we had every kind with us in metal matchboxes, but the boxes were wet, and we had not a dry rag of any kind to rub them with. We tried to make a tent out of my skirt to light a match under it, but our fingers were dripping wet and numb with cold. It's only a tiny reference, but there she is. She's climbing in a skirt and actually using, at this point, her skirt to try and create some kind of shelter or some kind of shield to warm themselves. By the early 20th century, things were starting to change sartorially in the way that women were dressing. Particularly in America, women were early adopters of the bifurcated garment there, so started to wear knickerbockers and breeches. This is a fantastic picture of the Sierra Club in America, and you can see these voluminous garments that women wore. But in the UK and Europe, it took slightly longer, and there were different solutions that were offered as fashions changed. Burberry had been a company that was clothing performance expeditions for some time, and in the early 20th century they started to recognise women as sporting consumers and designed what they called climbing gowns. This is a fantastic one from around 1908, and it shows what is a climbing gown, and it describes it as a practical and graceful model evolved from the experience of well-known alpinists, illustrates the highest attributes of freedom, protection and durability. The skirt can be divided and is one of 6 different examples of this principle. You can see the buttons at the back are an example of a kilted skirt. So by fastening the buttons, you effectively separate the skirt, but by fastening the buttons and separating them, you're creating different ways of wearing the skirt. So it was a really interesting solution to some of the things that women were starting to experiment with in the early 20th century. So thanks for tuning in. I don't think we can underestimate the achievements of these women and the different time and place to us, but the great strides that they made on the hills and mountains around the world were quite something. Tune in another time for episode 3.